Excellent, good. Good morning, everyone, and welcome back. I am delighted to see that the Belgian beers have been gentle on you. You also look excellent. My name is Tove Riding, and I coordinate the tax team at Eurodad. And I'm delighted to be moderating this panel on the financing gap and debunking the myth. As you can see, I also have a very, very good looking panel with me. But in addition to the three speakers we have here, we are also delighted to have with us online Professor Jati Ghosh. And Professor Ghosh will have to leave in about 25 minutes. So the way we're going to try and do this is that we'll have two rounds of questions for the panel that we'll kick off with. And then it is very much my ambition to involve you all as well. So we'll go to questions from the audience as well. And we have about 1.5 hours to tear apart this idea that there's a lack of money in the world. And we'll go to Professor Ghosh to start with. The first question that we'll address in the questioning round is from your point of view, are you hopeful or concerned about the current state of the global financial architecture discussion? And what are the risks of engaging or not in the ongoing processes and discussions that we see? And so the first view we'll get is from Professor Ghosh. I think Professor Ghosh requires no introduction, but I'll do it anyway. Professor Ghosh is, of course, an economist and also the co-chair of the Independent Commission on the Reform of International Corporate Taxation and a very frequent participant in the Financing for Development discussions. And I might add, I personally always enjoy hearing the inputs from Professor Ghosh. So thank you so much for joining us. What do you think about the ongoing financial architecture discussions? Please give us your view.
So thank you so much, Joan. And first of all, let me just say how much I appreciate Eurodad's work. I think you guys are amazing. I use your research all the time, and it's incredibly useful, not just for us involved in different kinds of policy making discussions, but for students and all kinds of people. So please keep it up. Yes. Where are we on the international financial architecture? Well, I think everybody agrees. In fact, that's the extraordinary thing. Everybody agrees that it's not fit for purpose. It's a mess. Everyone is saying that, including, you name it, Christine Lagarde, Janet Yellen, everybody says this is no good. Yet, when it comes to doing things about it, it's remarkably, shall we say, stagnant, slow moving. It's not even that, an elephant. Elephants move quite quickly, really. This is a situation where we are not short of ideas. There are any number of good suggestions. I've been involved in a high-level advisory board on effective multilateralism, where one of the things we looked at was the international financial architecture. We made a number of suggestions where, actually I'm really happy with 95% of those, okay? But that's it, that's there. The Bridgetown Initiative has come out with a number of suggestions. Again, you're all very familiar. It's just there. The Secretary General himself has produced a policy paper for our common agenda process towards the big summit that he's hoping to host next year. It's excellent. There are all kinds of wonderful suggestions in there and proposals. It's just out there. So there's no shortage of things we can do, things that need to be done, things that could be easily done, things which only require a tiny amount of political will. And the problem, very clearly, therefore, is that we don't have that, okay? Instead, we have, what can I say? We have a kind of endless amount of pageantry. We have COPs, the number of the COPs keeps going up, and it doesn't matter where you keep them. You can put them in the most fossil fuel exporting country, and you can invite all of the biggest fossil fuel exporters to come in their private jets. But you have the pageant where everybody declares that they want to do something for climate and finance, climate alleviation and all of that. You have the various annual meetings of the World Bank and the IMF, which many of us are forced to attend or end up attending to make the voice heard. It doesn't matter, because the voices are heard, or maybe they're not heard, but anyway, the voices exist and make noises. It doesn't translate into action. Now we're going to have a summit in Paris, right, later this month, the Macron organized summit for climate finance. And again, the questions it's asking are all correct. They're all there. And we know the answers. I mean, I could go into detail about the specific answers. I think your crowd will probably know the answers better than me. So we know the answers, but will they be discussed? No, they're not even in the agenda. Many of the more critical things are not in the agenda. We've just had a climate meeting in Bonn, in which climate finance was not allowed to be put on the agenda. So we have endless, expensive talk shows, a lot of pageantry for world leaders to go around saying that they're really concerned, and they want to do things and making all the right noises, yet nothing happens. So how do we shake this behemoth? What do we actually do? And I think that's really where we have to now focus our attention. What's holding things up in the IMF, which has to be revised? And it's one thing to say we can dump the IMF because it's been so terrible. There was a phase in my life when I used to say that what it really needs is a neutron bomb, so that you can replace all the personnel and the procedures, and you get a better outcome. But we can't simply say we'll do without it. We are unfortunately in a world where building a whole new set of multilateral institutions will take very long and will not happen. Also, the geopolitics is just not conducive. So how do we make these structures fit for purpose? What do we do? And the difficulty is that they remain controlled, the boards of these remain controlled according to voting shares and quota shares that were decided way back in the Bretton Woods conference in a very different world and with very different power balances. But they persist. And so the US and the European Union basically can determine whatever they do or don't do. And they clearly are not determined to do anything. Some of it is because of dysfunctional politics within their countries. In the US, for sure, that's the case, where I have been in the extraordinary position of having to defend the IMF to the US Congress Committee on Financial Services, because you have all these Republican senators saying, close the place down. And we don't want to give money to poor countries. They're just ripping the US off and so on. So, there is this problem. What do we who really do recognize the need for rapid and drastic change, what do we do? And I'm increasingly coming around to the idea that we have to build coalitions of the willing. Okay, this is a term that was used for all the wrong reasons in the Iraq war. But right now we have to actually think of ways in which different sets of countries can combine to fight for better terms and conditions and to cooperate with each other. And there are several ways in which this can happen. The first is tax cooperation. You mentioned that I'm on one of these committees that is dealing with corporate taxation. Again, we know what has to be done. It's low-hanging fruit, right? You have to tax multinationals as one company according to your share of their global profits, and then tax them the same rate that you're taxing your domestic companies. It seems easy, yet countries are terrified to do it because of all the different pressures. If countries get together and do it, small countries can actually together cooperate. It's already happening, it's beginning. There is a summit being convened in Latin America. Chile, Colombia, Brazil are organizing, and many other Latin American countries are coming to talk about tax cooperation for corporate taxation, for wealth taxation. And so, there is a potential out there. Groups of countries together can do things that individual countries will find much more difficult to do. They can also share information. So, of course, that's important for tax. But there's another area in which sharing of information is absolutely crucial. And that's for debtor countries. So, this old, and Eurodad, you have been so effective on so many issues, and you've been so excellent in your analysis of different debt contracts. However, individual countries keep getting into the same thing that they've been in for decades, which is that they have a debt problem. They get to face that whole room full of creditors, everybody yelling at them and telling them how they've been bad, and being forced to accept the worst conditions, with the IMF, basically being the ringmaster and deciding how exactly it's going to happen and so on. A debtors cartel, frankly, I think would be the best way. But even before that, the sharing of information across debtors. In Sri Lanka, they did not know the terms that Argentina had managed to get out of the IMF. And so we had arranged a conference in Colombo where Martin Guzman presented, and a lot of Sri Lankans were shocked that you can get even that out of the IMF because, their government had caved in completely and gone along with everything. So we need to even share information. Ghana, Zambia are forced to negotiate in isolation without even knowledge of the others. But imagine this sharing of knowledge, supposing it then becomes a sharing of other powers. Supposing countries get together and say, no, these are unacceptable terms, we're not going with them. And we're not going to repay. So fine, we won't get money immediately, but we'll stop spending on debt service, which currently is costing us 80% of our budget. So we will have money to do other things. In other words, there is a power in association which we really have to exploit. And I think that's important because if you do that, you will actually get more rapid responses from the global structure. The global structure is not slow because it can't be fast. We saw that it can be incredibly rapid if it's a Silicon Valley bank or a Credit Suisse. It can do it over the weekend, it can do it overnight, it can solve the problem. Right? So we have to force that change. And the only way to force that change is to create coalitions of the willing among different groups. They don't have to be regional, they can be, but basically we have to now try and build these coalitions.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for kicking us off this morning. I think we already have a great food for thought. And we're going to continue with the panel. I just have one little practical information that also when we go to the Q&A later on, that this session is getting recorded and will be put on the internet. So this is a chance to be heard by people that didn't make it here today, even though we have a big group. But if there is something that you don't want your mom to hear, don't say it today because we will be recording it and publishing it. And normally nobody minds. And the other thing is we might get a visit from a journalist. And so we're being potentially heard by other people than in this room, and I'm sure that's a good thing. And that's it. We're moving on in the debate. I think we are already off to a great start with discussing how to change the global politics and build coalitions. And Professor Ghosh mentioned some sort of summit that's going to be happening in Paris, and we thought, who better to speak to this than our poor member who has to live under Macron politics 24/7. The others don't have, we only have to deal with it every time there's a summit. But Lison Rebender from CCFD is here to give us a first-hand analysis from France. Can you tell us what this thing is?
Thank you, Joey, and thank you for being very compassionate to the French. I'm glad that June is coming to an end and the summit is soon over. So the Macron summit that we call, so it's called the New Financial Pact. It's funny that it was announced at the COP when the Global South had a victory of gaining the funds for loss and damages. And there was all this talk about the Bridgetown Initiative. And so Macron announced a summit to raise the issue of finance and create a new pact with southern countries. And the colleagues who was there at the COP just went to speak to his colleagues, to the diplomatic colleagues who were there, and they didn't know about it. So it was just like a Macron idea to do a big summit, and it's not the first that he has done. I am sure you remember the One Planet Summit, the Financing Common 1, 2, 3, and I think we also have a Financing the African Economy Summit. So it's a style that Macron has to like gather a lot of people in Paris. And this time the ambition was quite big. It was really an ambition of reforming the global architecture. And that's why it had many people very enthusiastic. For those of us that had this idea that it was going to be a big diplomatic show, I think we are going to be confirmed. But it's, I think it's also important to analyze that it's not only a diplomatic show, it has many risks around it. Yeah, it's really fueling this idea that there is no money and we need to reform the architecture, but the architecture is it's mostly the IFIs that need to get bigger, stronger, more money. And they are not speaking at all about like the debt issue, the tax issue are not like part of the global architecture. It's like more where could we give money more and where could we bring the private sector more to fuel this very northern narrative of financing for development. And the way it has worked is quite fascinating in a way because it's showed as very global, very maybe multilateral, and there are these working groups where it's mainly G7, G20 countries, sometimes one or two other countries, and they are speaking of this issue when they speak in other places, like at the IFI, at the G7, the G20 meeting. So they are just reiterating their thoughts on debt. Like on debt is broadcasted as a main issue of the summit, and they are only like speaking of a manual for the common framework and on bringing debt clauses to contract for when there is catastrophe, so for virtual contracts. So it can be a good measure, but it's nothing about the current debt crisis. And there is this idea that we need to find more money, so let's go for debt swap maybe, but nothing of debt cancellation, nothing on like reforming the debt architecture. It's really out of the table. And what is also very, I think it's very concerning that a lot of civil society has been quite excited about this summits. And it's a question for ourselves, like, how do we keep the ambition and how do we challenge our governments when they are putting that big show and they hope to have many head of states in Paris, but they will just reiterate their Northern Financing for Development agenda. And there is no way that it is going to be a real reform of the architecture. It will be both showed as such though. And a reflection I have also on this summit is that it's giving a lot of power to also global North civil societies. The French civil society has been like in front of it, dealing with Macron, dealing with the groups. And so sometimes we lack perspective on what is really needed because we are looking towards an opportunity. And when we are following all this kind of opportunity, we are also many often lacking the distance to see what's really at stake. And here it's reiterating this global North power on financing for development. And yeah, I think I could go into detail on what's going to happen in Paris next week. What is interesting, it's the way they announced it at the beginning and what is going to show. It's like, it's no way it's a reform of the global architecture. It was never on the plans. And there are really little good measures that are at stake, that's like debt clauses that are not like bad in essence, maybe pushing for a new tax for loss and damage, which has a lot of climate colleagues very excited, but it's really not a global reform that we need.
It's I can't say excellent, but thank you so much for this excellent wake-up call at least. And yes, let's not be in a northern CSO bubble and reinforce this European idea that we can just meet here and decide how the global structure should look like. So I'm very happy to hand over to Glenys Belan from Ebon.
Thank you, Tova, and thank you for having us here. I did not come from the Philippines. I'm actually based here, but yeah. I'm from Ibon International, an international southern-based CSO based in Manila. And we've been following closely the developments in and the debates in financing for development. And this buzzword called financing gap, we think has been capitalized on by international financial institutions to reduce the question of development to a question of money. And therefore, if it's only a question or a problem of money, then it only needs a monetary solution. And that is where I think the problem with all these shows and talks of reform are all about. So, for example, in terms of the World Bank trying to reform itself from the inside, and at face value, we see, okay, it's conforming to the times. It's adapting to the poly crisis, to the climate crisis. But at the core of it, the World Bank is still upholding the moribund dogma that private capital is paramount to solving our development problems. So it did not veer away from its original tenet, its paradigm, and thus it will not overhaul the financial architecture. That being said, there's also an overemphasis on blended finance, or as the international community would like to call it, leveraging public finance, but it actually uses public money for private gain. So however they would want to use other terms, that's still one of the core principles of the evolutionary method. Second is or third, it's problematic if the World Bank recommends a reform without admitting to its sins. So we think that for it to be credible in suggesting new commitments or new ways for financing for development, that it should have a reckoning of sorts, that it is responsible for the underdevelopment of the South. It is responsible for the huge amounts of capital and resource drains from the South to the North, because we all know the statistics drain from the South to the North, that the South is subsidizing Northern economies, not only in terms of resource drains or the potential for development of Southern countries, but also in terms even of low wages, repressed wages, and other neoliberal policies that's brought about by mainly by the structural adjustments that was imposed by the IMF, World Bank during the 1970s, 80s to third world countries in Asia, in Africa. So I think it's imperative for us to be really critical with how the World Bank is trying to sell us that it's going to reform itself, but it cannot even admit its wrongdoings.
Excellent, thank you so much. We're just gonna finish off this first round of questions by hearing from a very dear colleague. One of the things some people sometimes say about us in Europe is that we are UN lovers, a UNophile, and one group that never says that is the UN Secretariat. And because they find us these annoying people that keep banging on about the civil society's central role in the UN. And one of the reasons why we keep that battle very much alive is because we say, go Stefano, go tell them that we want more time for CSO interventions. And thank you for being here today and for giving us your your own intervention, and normally you fight for our chance to speak, and we're very delighted to have you here to speak to the same question. What do you think about the discussion, and what are the risks of engaging or not?
Thanks so much, Tove, and thanks to all of you. So three thoughts. The first one is that I think for the first time in a very long time on economic governance matters, we have a window of opportunity. So despite all the complexity that we've had, I think I want to open on a positive, encouraging note. This window of opportunity comes, I think, from a nexus of different things. The first one is a revival of geopolitics, particularly the tension between the US and China that in many ways makes the South again necessary, maybe for the wrong reasons, but I think it is an element that we didn't have in the past period, which was largely a period of hegemony. Secondly, I think never before in history there's been clarity, even in official documents, on the fact that all the false solutions that have been proposed over the recent years are simply not working. Being it the common framework, being in the nonsense OECD solution, and many more. And it's interesting because as much as that critique has always been, it's never been so clear, crystal clear, even in official documents, that's where we are. Thirdly, there's the evidence that all the public money that we pretended not to have just required a weekend phone call, as Jayari mentioned, because we could generate more money overnight for saving banks than we could generate through the entire SDR process for the entire global South. So the notion that public money isn't there, maybe lacks a little evidence right now. And lastly, I think there is a spillover of enthusiasm. The decision to initiate a UN tax process in December, let's be honest, we were also the one surprised, right? Despite have been calling for that, it just happened. And some of you would say, well, it has happened for, maybe it was a yes that many countries actually meant no. But there is one golden rule in the UN. It's very, very difficult to get something started. But they will soon discover that there is one thing that you simply can't do in the end, which is to kill something. So once you have it, no matter whether you have it for the right or the wrong reasons, it's there to stay. And I think that's something which generate addiction. I think you could really see the addictive behavior of a number of member states in April that said, oh gosh, we've decided this something at last, so we can. Oh, that's nice, and immediately they started raising the stake on issues related to debt architecture and more. So I think I want to start with that positive note. I think there is a window of opportunity, and there is a spillover effect of a decision that we've been, working towards for many years, and that eventually has happened. Now, is the system around us just watching and seeing the opportunity and let us go ahead with it? No, of course not. So I think the strategy that's been chosen is a very old one. If you can convince them, confuse them. So there is where you have a plethora of initiatives, summits, agendas, all sorts of things, like reforms of every sort. Well, I think we need to be very, very careful not to get lost into the strategy. The strategy is a smoke screen. It's a smoke screen to make sure you get confused enough and you start chasing red herrings left and right rather than sticking to purpose. And in that strategy, urgency is traditionally the key forcing. I'm not sure if the pain or the opportunity to work through many domains, and you can see that there's always a grand narrative. Now we have the grand narrative of the financing gap. In food, you have the grand narrative of the urgency to feed the world. In health, you have the grand narrative of providing vaccines now, forget how and who produces them. they're necessary now. So you always have a grand narrative related to urgency. And part of it is basically is combined with the smokescreen challenge to say, there's a lot of urgency, forget, go ahead. So I think we need to be very, very clear in all of these on where to keep somehow our focus. And here, three quick things. The first one is that we need to shift gear. The first thing is that it's clear that we've been putting too much emphasis on policy reforms or policy discussions versus systemic institutional reforms. You need to today think not about having more recipes, but what kind of oven you need to cook them. And, I'm Italian, so I'll always, they're just not gonna let me back home if I don't have a joke about food. And this is where I think we need to put much more emphasis. Taxes is a very good example. Forget for a moment the discussion of which tax regime we need. We need a new institution, a new process, democratic process, where to decide on it. Because otherwise we keep discussing policies in the wrong place. That continues to be permeated by power asymmetries and political economy. Secondly, we need to choose the turf. Come on, the global will never be a context which is free of political economies. But there are different turfs. Why the UN? Because it has jurisdiction, because it's a place where we can tame pure economic power with developmental considerations, because we can frame challenges in the broader political setting. You cannot disentangle debt from the ecological debt and its systemic determinants in the structure of the economy, because it's democratic, at least on paper, last time I checked, and because there is some extent of civic accountability and possibility to participate. Lastly, it's not only about having clarity on institutional reform versus policy, choosing the turf that in this particular case is the United Nations, and lastly, we need to change our approach with the bank and the IMF. Now, we need to be a little bit critical here, right? We have been, and sorry if this may sound harsh, the beauty clinic of the bank for a long time. Meaning we provided endless opportunity for cosmetic makeup. We've been the one providing the narrative to embellish frameworks that were fundamentally at odds with anything we believe in. I think we've got to take a very significant break on that and maybe reflect on what is the best way to reform these institutions. Is it from inside? Or is it because we generate inhibiting competition? We do create a different ecosystem that automatically from outside limits their mandate, blocks their mandate beyond the hegemonic expansion that they have in the past period, and defund them. So my sense is if we have clarity on this, then we are able to, somehow look through the fog and catch the window of opportunity.
Awesome, thank you so much. Sorry, I forgot to say this was Stefano Prato from Society for International Development and coordinator of the Financing for Development Civil Society Mechanism. Good. We've been slightly naughty because we've gone a bit over time as compared to what we promised. Professor Bosch, who had to run to a lunch. Just going to see if we still have her with us, even though I have broken my promise of keeping the first round to half an hour. She's probably had to leave. She might be back later. But anyway, we will continue with the panel for what I would call a quick round. And the reason we want to keep it quick is because we want to involve you all in this discussion. I think we've already had a lot of provocative statements. You are all the beauty clinics of the World Bank people. What do you think about that? And please chip into this debate. So start thinking about what you want to say and comment and questions and inputs. This is a strategy discussion. But before we go to that, I'll do a quick round with the panel to answer the question, how can we, in all this confusion, maintain a focus on a truly transformative agenda. What do you think, Lisa?
I think Stefano already answered a bit. I will just reflect on the Macron Summit and the job we've been doing, like trying to keep it in check. 3 quick reflections. I think we need to call our government out for what they are doing, especially when they are putting some policy reform that we could be okay with it, but are not really changing the architecture, and especially the northern governments when they are keeping the driving seat. We need to call them out and not just follow the policy and really say, okay, that's what's happening and we are not okay with it. It's not always comfortable, and we know it's not comfortable also to always be the one saying, no, it's not working, and we need to find ways to really explain it well to the media, but we need to really keep this ambition. I think for us in France, it's really a challenge, not to always follow the opportunity, but to keep the global picture and to keep the ambition. I think we need to really don't give up on our big goals. And I'm glad to be here with you today, because what happened with the UN Tax Convention is really an example of when we keep focused on the big reform that we want for a long time and not just follow everyone and then the opportunity, it can happen, but it needs to we need to really stay focused. And also reflection we had, like in France, what really was an opportunity for us with the Macron Summit was to speak more and more with the climate colleagues. And yes, we need to work with others. Because when we are united, the development, the economic justice, and the climate movement, we can be very, very strong. It's not always comfortable because we need to really get another point of view, re-explain many things that for us are really quite usual, normal, and that we don't want to put up for debate. But if we have these thoughts and then if we work together, we can be much more stronger.
Fantastic, very to the point.
Thank you. Yesterday we were discussing about how a lot of us are in the defensive in terms of engagement, but I would be very brave to say that we can go on offensive because the narrative, the correct narrative is with us. We cannot let ourselves be pushed against the wall with the dominant narrative now that there's a financing gap. We know that there's not, and that we can take back the narrative from talking about the financing gap to talking about drains from the south to the north. For that, we need a critical and grounded analysis that of the problem. And from that critical grounded analysis of the problem, we can articulate our solution. I think now that a lot of us are talking about how in the general public or the broader public that some of us are like talking in our echo chambers, that the challenge is how to have more resonance with the broader public. How do we bring our messages across? And also, how are we bringing the voices of the grassroots to not only to policy spaces, but also to a broader audience. So for us, from a southern based CSO, we think that there's a combination of systemic recommendations or solutions and national based solutions, so that people have been indebted, who have been underdeveloped due to decades of neoliberal policy, can also assert the right to development and the development that they envision. So systemic wise, we are pushing for a break from the private investment-led profiteering that southern economies have been undergoing for the last 3 decades. Progressive taxation on the national front, but also at the global level. And I'm glad that this is being discussed now at the global level. Accountability for corporations that are still doing extractive, harmful activities in the global south, and an international mechanism to have that accountability. At the national level, we also want to see a break from like impositions on the agriculture sector, whether that's on trade, preeminence of the free trade that has destroyed the agriculture sector of a lot of southern countries, including the dependence on pesticides and other harmful chemicals. We want the opportunity to be able to identify key sectors and key resources to develop. We want to have progressive taxation at the national level as well, and a host of other things. And we have that on paper, but at the core of it, I think that by working with social movements, with people's movements on the ground, that's key to how we can strengthen ourselves. Because if you want to be politically powerful, that there's strength in numbers, and we collaborate, but we also have to broaden ourselves and make sure that we arouse the broader public, we organize them, and then we mobilize them to action. Thank you.
Thanks. So I know I spoke too much earlier, so let me be very, very quick here. So three things. The first one is that, and linking to what you just said, is that we need to recognize that within development finance movements, organizations, network, there's been far too much financialization. I want to reconnect to the panel yesterday. I think we lost a very clear connection with the transformation of the economy, with the structure of the economy. I mean, fine that we can tackle tax and debt crisis, but what are we taxing? Is the structure of the economy doesn't change. And the need for that ultimately depends from that. And I think as much as we all agree with that, I think it's too choreographical in our strategy. We just have it up there as some sort of overall cosmetic and choreography, but we've lost engagement on it. I mean, if you look through the development finance advocacy, how many people engage in issues related to actual real economy transformation? Very, very few. And that's because of the technicalization of many of our networks, particularly in the North, and the disconnect with social movements that, of course, come from struggle, and therefore they have a different approach to the priority of the real economy versus the financial economy. So that's the fundamental issue. The second one is we are too scared of dealing with the global finance elephant. I think we sometimes think that we can resolve tax and debt, for instance, without really engaging in systemic, profound, normative reform of global financial system and monetary system. And you know, this is not only the financial bubble, financialization is trickling down to very, very real life concern, particularly now in a phase of high interest rates where, you know, currency devaluation is significant and the cost of milk is different in the morning and in the evening in some countries. So it's not only about dealing with that financial bubble down there, it's actually percolating down to real life experiences. And to be honest, beyond knowing that it is the problem, we don't have an agenda on exactly how we want to tackle that. And that's, I think, is a second big piece. And lastly, and shortly, we need to keep it political. I think we have been too busy with technical rabbit holes. And that is not the moment. That is not the moment to think what is feasible. In a moment of structural transition like this, and in a moment of opportunities, what matters is what's right, not what's feasible.
Thank you so much. I'm just looking to my colleagues to see whether we have microphones for the audience so that we can collect questions. Otherwise, I will happily hand over. No, there we go. All right. These were the opening remarks, and it's now over to you all to chip in with questions, comments. Who wants to break the ice? Yes, we have a question on the first row, and if there's anyone else, yes, good. Coming to you later, please.
Thank you so much. Really, really inspiring conversation that we have witnessed. My question to you is, where do you see in this debate the issue of reparations? that is becoming maybe an interesting political group to build a critical mass of Southern movements and voices, governments? How do you play this? How do you see this play in this debate for next year?
Please introduce yourselves also.
Ana Alcalde from ActionAid. Thank you.
Thank you so much. We have some questions up in the back as well. And I'm going to send you on a bit of a sprint here. I think we'll do 3 questions in the first round and then we'll come back to you. Thank you, Sana.
Yeah, thanks for a really great panel. And thanks for the fact I'm quite much better. I can remember my affiliation. And day 2. Yeah, I guess to return to a little bit the title of the panel, which is about the financing gap narrative. And so I guess in a way, this is the sort of pernicious agenda behind the pageantry at the moment, in that it attempts to reinforce this idea that more public money is not necessary, in fact, from rich countries. And so this is very much the agenda at the World Bank that we're dealing with at the moment, is that actually the G7 is strongly pushing this idea that no one need write a check. That in fact is being articulated in these discussions. And so I think, well, there's many things we could discuss around this, but clearly there is a need for financing of some type, right? And so, again, what Stefano mentioned, this idea of the sort of urgency of the crisis. And the climate crisis is a big vessel for this, of course. A way to sort of justify this agenda. These figures of the financing gap, and in particular the Songway-Stern report calling for, I think, 4 trillion in financing by 2030, are in a way being weaponized to support all the things we're sort of against, this wider network. In particular, a rapid expansion of the MDB system, but also a rapid scaling up of private financing, especially from the sort of political West. So, yeah, I would just, I guess, offer that as an intervention, in that I think in a way the pageantry is a distraction, but there's also quite a lot of pernicious elements emerging from this moment as well. And maybe we don't need to be so concerned about them, because I don't think it's realistic that the MDBs are going to triple their lending in 5 years. I don't think practically that's going to happen for a number of reasons. But yeah, I would, I guess, offer the panel a chance to reflect on these dynamics a bit more, in terms of, you know, clearly we need to debunk the financing gap in a way of saying that financing is necessary, but it's not about the trillion, it's about the type of financing, right? And the sort of normative structures that financing implies. Thanks.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. And we had another question at the back somewhere.
Yeah.
Hi, yes, Jacob with Oxfam. I wanted to respond to Stefano's beauty queen comment, which I can identify with. But so my point, I guess, is as an advocate, our goal should be commensurate with our power. And 20 years ago, the Jubilee movement was really powerful. You know, thousands of people in the streets, discussion in churches, and so on. I have felt throughout my career, seen the power of the international development movement in general, beyond that, just the whole movement, declining inexorably, and declining in the terms of the ability of putting thousands of people in the streets. And so for me, the question is not so much whether we should do inside advocacy at the UN or inside advocacy at the IMF, but how do we put thousands of people in the streets for any goal, really? But as long as we don't have that, I do think it's probably, if we have only inside advocacy in our toolbox, then I think the IMF is a place where we can have more impact than the UN. But the real question is really how we put thousands of people back in the streets. Having a more radical message is not necessarily better. It can be, I think, but not necessarily. And definitely the message or the target or the goal even is not sufficient. There are a lot of other things that we need to do, and I don't have the response about how we do it. That is just a challenge I have. Thank you.
Thank you so much for the challenges, and thank you for being here. One of the fascinating things about these Eurodad conferences is that the conference call people become real people. A pleasure to meet you, Didier. Fantastic. Thank you so much for these inputs. We'll go to the panel for a first round, and then it's back to you guys afterwards. So we have reparations, we have a financing gap, and debunking all the discussions that are going on about whether anyone should write a check. And we have a question about people in the streets. Well, there's lots of people in the streets when Macron tries to do economic issues nationally. And it's great to start with you, Giselle.
Yes, I was thinking of that. We French have been in the street for a long time now. I've been in the street many times. We still haven't won, but this fight probably will win the big battle. Yeah, tough question because I don't have the answer to most of them. I struggle too with the financing gap. I mean, the whole Macron summit is like we lack money, and for many people, even internally within CSOs, we're like, yes, but we do need the money, but we need to count the needs, so we need to offer like flows, and it's quite difficult to step away and look at the bigger picture. So the type of financing, yes, but also like the policy space. I really try to also like say, we can't only count the flows, we need to really discuss the policy space of countries, how they can decide, how they can be democratic decisions to really think about the power. For me, that's a debate we are really missing. We focus on the financing gap, but it's difficult to react to that in many discussions. I will stay there.
Great, Ernest.
Yeah, thank you for the comment on the financing gap. Yeah, it's true. We need money. So we're not saying that because that narrative is false, that we don't need money. And it's also in relation to the reparation question. But I've been thinking about it for a long time because we've been saying, yeah, we need to keep the 0.7 target of ODA alive. And we also need to engage that it's real ODA and not some money that has been used for other things. So I think it's a complementary strategy that while we push based on our identification of the problem, that we push for solutions, and we push still for our campaigns, that the big picture is the South has been footing the bill, and that's where the money came from, and that's where the money is. So for the opportunities for reparation, it's happening at the COP and in the climate finance discussions. But also I think that when we talk about campaigns on the World Bank, not engaging, I mean not influencing the World Bank from the inside, is that we talk about this because the World Bank, the IMF has a lot to do with the debts of the South and the underdevelopment of the South, and that narrative has to be out there and not buried under operational roadmaps and reforms.
Thank you so much, Stefano.
Yes, thanks. So let me start with the issue of reparations, building on what you just said. I think that is a fundamental pillar of our political agenda and strategy forward, in particularly in really rethinking the locus where we want to discuss debt. Because you see the extent to which we discuss debt in policy spaces where the issue is the repayment of creditors, the repayment of contracts only, then we get stuck in a very narrow understanding that does not embrace the wider political context of debt, in which most of the countries which are defined as debtors are in fact creditors from a point of view of both ecological and historical colonial reparations. And that's a fundamental reason why debt has to be addressed politically in a context, and in this particular case in the United Nations, where these elements, even if then eventually you need to find, yes, solutions that correspond to the contract issue, I'm not shying away from it, but the political context in which you do that allows for those dimensions to have a very strong weight, versus other spaces in which those dimensions are simply off the agenda because you have an inclusive focus on the repayment of contracts. On Didier, I think, raises a very, very pertinent issue. One can say that there are different dynamics at play. We certainly have spent much more time advocating for technical, small things into locked rooms than talking to our base. If you think back and think in all of us how much time we spent in advocating or in trying to widening the social base of our advocacy, I think we all know what the answer is, right? So I think there is some critique that we ourselves have to do. But times have also changed. And for instance, in Europe today, we're confronted with an increasing wave of right-wing positions, and in many ways the right-wing narrative have captured the counter-globalization narrative and twisted it all around, So while the counter-globalization narrative was a left agenda, right now is actually the agenda for a new nationalism, So I don't think we have very great clarity on how we position ourselves in that, but at least as a building block, we lost touch with many of our colleagues in the wider, at least civil society, social movement angle. So before we get to the streets, which I think is a far more complicated issue, if at least we can widen the base for our advocacy within the wider civil society map, that would be already a major step. And let's be honest, this group here has ideas which are completely at odds with the larger, SDG cheerleading crowd. Is what Lison has also mentioned in the tension between some more radical positions in some of the French CSO and others. So I think we have some clear political advocacy there. And this takes to your issue. You see, why most of these things are distractions is because we keep being busy with useless engagements while we lose track of that wider political strategy. Ultimately, with you, if you do one thing, you're not going to do the other. And the more we chase meetings that have no reasons to exist, the more we devote little time to building a political counterpower, which is what we need.
Excellent. And I'm very happy that we also have Professor Bush back with us. I want to just try and bring you in because we have a first round of questions that I think have been very interesting. And I'll do my best to recap. The first question is on reparations. What role does reparations play in the debate? This seems to be an up and coming issue. The second question was indeed on the essence of this panel. How do we debunk this idea of a financing gap? And there seems to be some sort of a conclusion coming out of the global north that actually nobody needs to write a public resources check. No one needs to pay more public resources. We'll just get that private capital to save us all. And the last question was very interesting, was about how we get people back in the streets. How do we mobilize? So some very nice and provocative questions. And I wonder whether you have any thoughts on this.
Wow, such huge questions and such very good questions on reparations. So here's the thing, of course, I completely believe that countries deserve reparations. I mean, the kind of pillage, the centuries of extraction and exploitation, et cetera, and the fact that they are not responsible for most of the carbon emissions in the world, either historically or currently. And in fact, you know, the recent climate inequality report is really stark, that the worst affected will be the countries that actually contributed least. And within those countries, the populations that contributed least, in fact, didn't contribute at all, will be even within that the worst affected. Having said that, okay, we can demand reparations. Are they going to happen? No. I mean, this is now a global political economy in which, after much pushing, they announce a loss and damage fund and then do nothing at all for 8 months, 9 months, right? So in other words, we are dealing with a very different global world in which, yes, we can keep demanding reparations. Are they going to happen in the immediate future, or let's face it, even in the foreseeable future? No. How do we then force this to happen? How do we even force, you know, a loss and damage fund? So here's the thing. I don't believe that in the global north, there's going to be a sudden, how shall I put it, you know, sudden seeing the light and saying, okay, now we will be good and we will give our promised 100 billion and we will give, you know, loss and damage money and we will do da and da. It's not going to happen. What we do have to do is to change the ways in which, at least from the global system, money can be provided immediately, or automatically certain things get written off. So, for example, you could put in rules in the global system that if a country has a major climate disaster, let's say Pakistan lost 26 billion in the floods last year, okay, approximately 26 billion worth, US dollars billion worth of losses there. That amount of debt equivalent should be written off. You know, if you're giving SDRs, if you're allocating SDRs, that's one of the proposals we made in that board on effective multilateralism, we have to change the way of allocation. Stop giving most of the SDRs to countries that will never use it. It requires a change in the IMF Articles of Agreement, but hey, that can be changed. You know, it's not written in stone and it's not fixed forever in perpetuity. So change the Articles of Agreement so that SDRs are distributed according to need. For a climate disaster, for extreme debt stress, for, you know, various other conditions that can be specified. Now, the beauty of that is that it doesn't cost money for other countries. We know that, you know, most countries, the politics are such that, at least in the advanced world, they are not going to spare that money. So we can criticize the Biden administration, and there's a lot to criticize out there. But I can assure you a Republican administration would be much worse. They would say, we won't even fund the IMF. We won't even give any contributions to the World Bank, and so on. In France, in Germany, I mean, yeah, you know, it's a lot of hypocrisy. But the right wing out there is going to be not hypocritical. It will be straightforward and say, we don't care what happens to the rest of the world. We're not going to do that. So let's at least now push towards some kinds of multilateral arrangements where this very low-hanging fruit of SDRs can actually be automatically issued and then be allocated to countries in need. Because that's the kind of thing that would at least have an impact, you know, whether to meet development needs, whether to cope with climate, everything. On how do we do the politics of it? You guys know better than me, right? I don't know anymore. I'm in a country where the politics has gone completely the other way. Even as inequality goes up, as material insecurity of the working class and farmers increases, the politics goes the other way. So I don't know how it works. But I do know that people in the North who are progressive and aware of all of this and are anti-colonial and anti-neo-colonial and all that, they have to do, and finally that's where so many decisions are made, right? They have to do much more in terms of just getting ordinary people there aware that this matters also for them. that is not just about being nice to all those poor dark people out in different continents. It's actually something that will impact them. That's a message which I don't believe is reaching most of the population in the rich countries. And the way things are structured, it's still that which drives even, you know, all these international or multilateral things. I don't think we can expect more, you know, promised aid. I don't think we can even expect technical assistance. We have to now therefore find our own ways and solutions. I mean, you know, Africa is developing an mRNA hub. It's doing much more. The CDC in Africa is actually doing much more to create domestic technological awareness about future pandemics and the possibilities, and sharing that scientific knowledge within that region and sharing production capacity. So we have to be doing all of those things, and that actually puts pressure on the North. I mean, it's only a fear of irrelevance that would actually force a change. I think I'm being cynical maybe, but that seems to be the case.
Thank you so much. And cynicism is definitely allowed. Let's, speaking of which, we're opening the second, and I think it will also be the last round of questions. Questions, comments, cynicism, humor, everything is allowed. Yes, we have a question up here on the second row. All right, we'll have two questions up here, and now we just need a microphone over to the left side of the room. Ah, there it is.
Just needed to press the on button, so I didn't think of doing that. Hi, thanks so much. What an interesting conversation. I'm Carly Munnelly from Save the Children UK. Yes, I had a question, reflection about sequencing, the timings of doing some of this stuff, and the fact that we have limited resources as a movement. And I guess I was thinking about the big structural changes that are needed, or maybe that we think are needed to our economic system, versus the sort of quick technical changes to our system that actually would put dollars in, you know, government coffers and make a real difference to people in the short term, right? Like action on debt would make a real difference to what governments could then spend on health and education and nutrition and short-term, you know, changes that can really impact people's lives. And so I guess given our sort of limited resources as a movement, if we take our foot off the pedal in one area to put it on, you know, building momentum around shifting the narrative around, you know, structural bigger changes to our economic system, there are trade-offs there. So I guess I was wondering if you could sort of reflect on those trade-offs and the sort of sequencing of how we might do some of this stuff and make that change. Thanks.
Thank you. And the next question in the front, and there's room for one more question if good. Okay, yes.
Thanks very much. Luis with the Bretton Project. I was scared I thought a panel was going to pass without my intervention. But
We wouldn't do that.
So thanks very much. I have one super quick comment. You know, language is important, and relating to what Stefan said about transformation, about addressing financialization, the deep restructuring that the economy has taken in the past 30 years or so. I really think that we should make an effort not to fall into the just transition trap. It's not a transition we're talking about a transformation. And I mean, I know, you know, it sounds very inane thing to say, but I think if we grab onto the focus on transformation, it really allows us to start having a different discussion rather than transition. Transition sounds so innocuous, you know, we're gonna, you know, seamlessly and effortlessly transition from one thing to the next. I don't think that's true. And then, you know, Professor Gosh said that, and you're right, you know, there's been a call for multilateral reform from predating COVID, you know, Lagarde made a call for new multilateralism. Where did that come from? It came from fear. You know, the reason the shareholders in the North, etc., are reacting, the reason the Bridgetown mission is gaining traction for whatever its weaknesses is because the shareholders in the global North, they're afraid of instability. They're afraid of the unraveling of the multilateral system, the trading systems that exist. I don't think we're doing nearly enough to capture that the fear that exists and making an argument of self-interest on the part of the global North governments to say, you know, if you're smart, you start changing the architecture now to address some of these needs and concerns of the global south, because if you don't do that, other solutions will be found. And you already see the fragmentation of the multilateral order. You have the AI, you have the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, the New Development Bank. There are talks about the regional mechanisms, which I realize those can be good answers regionally, but I think we can argue, or I would argue that it is important to have sorry, I'm almost done, but I think it is important to maintain, a robust multilateral system where things can be discussed rather than a fragmented one. So I think we can do more to explore those avenues and maybe reach out to people who would not normally be our allies. Thanks.
Thank you. And of course, you wouldn't have the panel without your comment. Very happy to have it. And thank you so much. Last input.
Thanks for the panel. Very rich discussion. Maria Jose Romero with Europe. I will just raise a question and invite the panel to also reflect on something that, well, Luis mentioned passing, which is the Bridgetown initiative, right? It has not been part of your points, but I think that it comes from quite a lot of narrative that we heard last year, that it's about reforming the system, which is against some of the rules that have governed the system. But when we see what is there in the actual proposal, we still have some concerns in relation to the nature of the proposals, the narrative that is being presented. They are quite similar to some of the points that John mentioned before. So I would invite you to reflect a bit on that. And lastly, I'm looking even beyond this year. I would also invite the panel to offer some reflections on the opportunities that we have looking at the fourth financing conference on financing for development, right? So because some of the points that I guess that all of you have mentioned can be addressed in another forum, right? So would the fourth financing conference on financing for development offer some of these? I am asking only a rhetorical question here, but I would like to hear explicitly your thoughts on that. Thanks.
Excellent. We will do our best to deliver on that. So we go to the panel for a last round of answers and any quick closing remarks. We have 12 minutes left, and I'm happy to start by handing it back to Professor Ghosh on these issues. There's questions on sequencing and limited resources and the quick technical changes versus the grand revolution. There's questions about making the global north see the self-interest in hurrying up and changing before we change it for them. And then we have questions on the Bridgetown Initiative and the fourth Financing for Development Conference. Professor Ghosh.
Yeah, thank you very much. Big questions again. So let me begin with the limited resources, because I think that's a really critical concern, and that's true of lots of NGO social movements and so on. That, also we're forced to operate on so many different levels that you end up spreading yourselves thin, and it's quite difficult. And I think some of this is actually, again, okay, being cynical, I think some of this is intentional on the part of the global, the global structures. Okay, so maybe we shouldn't be sort of, constantly grabbing the coattails of the big global formats, joining to be on the sidelines of all the big summits at the point where it's happening. So, you will find all my friends, all my people I support and help and work with, everybody showing up at all of these meetings. And of course, there are more and more of them, right? So there's the IMF World Bank Spring meeting, and then there are new summits. You name a summit and it's happening, right? And then there's COP, and then there's some other financing thing, and then there's financing for development, there's high-level political forum, there's, you name it, something's happening. And now, of course, there are going to be these big global summits. There's the UN Social Summit, there's the SDG Summit, there's the Summit for the Future, etc. Instead of showing up at the summit, maybe we should be actually focusing our attentions on the backroom work. Making countries that are the ones who are going to be voting determined, or giving them the technical capacity, or giving them just the oomph to keep, making particular positions. And here I'm basing myself on the discussions on tax again. So you know how the OECD basically took it over and then brought along all the developing countries to claim it as an inclusive process, which really meant that you didn't get a seat at the main table. You got, the back seats in those seminar rooms, the ones that line the walls and don't have the mics. So you got those seats, but nonetheless inclusive, right? And it ended up, because it was such a non-inclusive process, it ended up with really terrible outcomes, in the sense that tiny amounts of additional taxes in return for giving up your own taxing rights. And most of those additional taxes would go to the north because of all the small print and nonsense. The group of Africa was in the UN simultaneously campaigning to make this something that goes to the UN process, not the OECD. And of course, completely resisted by G7 or Security Council members, G5, whatever, all the big guys rejected it, saying it's not going to happen. But they persisted and persisted and persisted. And in fact, I think it was the sheer wearing down. I mean, I still don't know what the whole dynamics of it was, but the sheer wearing down means that you actually got that vote in November last year. You got that vote. It's now a UN process. Now, of course, we know that in fact, all the knives are out and everybody's going to try and prevent that UN process from going anywhere. At least, the empire will try and prevent it from going anywhere. But that's where we should be focusing. If we're really concerned about tax, let's not just go to the final meeting, because it's all decided by then. Nothing happens in those final meetings. And they know that too, right? That's why all of these organizations, they have a little space for NGOs and civil society and social movements. They let us into rooms and give us access, and they have a whole desk. The World Bank has a whole desk for dealing with CSOs. The IMF has a whole division dealing with CSOs. They know, okay, it's like a pressure cooker where you let these guys come to the room, hold forth. It doesn't mean anything, but it'll show that we're engaged, and fine. We shouldn't be handing it over to them like that. We should say, we don't want to attend your meeting because anyway, it's irrelevant whether we go or not. We want to make sure that the people who are in that meeting are able to make so much noise that it's actually difficult. I think people in this room are too young to remember Seattle, but the WTO meeting in Seattle that collapsed, everybody thought it was because of rioters on the street. No, it's because developing country people inside the room said, this is ridiculous, we will not accept it. So I think we should be doing more of the backroom stuff myself.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. And wearing down the forces of power. I think that's one to add for the to-do list, and great food for thoughts. What do you think, Lison?
Yeah, I want to reflect again on the Macron summit, but like for 6 months, French civil society will be doing just that, and it will end up in mostly nothing. We should really reflect on it. Like, I think it was our job to really follow it and also give you the information, and to not let it just go by closed door and we have a watch on it, but it's really taking our limited resources for all this diplomatic show. It's very difficult then to focus on the important stuff. And also reflection on the short term, long term for me. I mean, like for the UN, for the UN talks, when there were the OECD discussions, some people were saying, but if you speak about the UN, you are missing the OECD agenda. The fact that people were very ambitious of the UN could only mean also that people within the OECD negotiations were feeling the high of having to get bigger, stronger, because we were putting the pressure. Sometimes fighting for the big solution doesn't, it also helps for the quick short-term solutions. And like on debt, of course, solution like we will need debt solution quick to save lives, but I mean, what they have been happening for 3-4 years now, it's like very, very slow, their quick solutions are very slow. So we need to keep asking for the big one, and maybe it will help them also get quicker on the short-term solutions. Just a reflection on how can we, does fear help like our northern governments? I'm a bit torn because like I see that France is hosting the OECD, France is hosting the club, Paris Club on debt, so it's they are in G7, G20. Sometimes I'm not completely at ease when we say, do that, or otherwise you will lose power, because we want them not to have the driving seat. So we don't want to comfort them and having this driving seat, we really need about more democratization.
Excellent. Dennis, what do you think?
I would like to reflect on the Bridgetown initiative. It has credibility because it comes from a southern country, and it's one of that. First, it has been hijacked by Macron. So second, it's a moving target. Also, we will have to see what would be the details of that Bridgetown initiative, and the northern governments are now trying to latch on it. There's a poor prospects that it will amount to something really substantial. That being said, there are good things coming from nothing. There are some good suggestions on the Bridgetown initiative, especially on the role of the IMF. But given all that, it's not enough to overhaul the architectural system. Aside from that, it gives it a progressive cover. The proposals and the recommendations supports the ongoing dominant narrative of private finance first, more role, expanded role for the MDBs and all that. So we wait and see. We should be very critical about the details of it and how the geopolitics plays into the Bridgetown initiative. There's another one that I would like to reflect on. The short term and the long term. I think we should be clear on our objectives in engaging in the short term. So it's a realistic expectation, but I think in engaging, we should be asking questions in engaging in these spaces. Will the voice of the southern peoples be heard? Will it be on the agenda? Second, is there a space to change something from the inside? And third, will there be a result afterwards for civil society? So and I think that's how we will prioritize, so that we are not everywhere and nowhere. But at the end of it all, I think that we should be contributing to how people build their own sovereignty. And their own sovereignty is how we support, or we are with them, we are with the people in building their capacities on how to raise their voices and how they can express or forward their own agenda for development. And that takes a long time. But at the end of the long road, that will be the most substantial thing that we can do to have a long-term strengthening and building up of our forces to have the society, the economy that we want. Yeah.
Okay, on sequencing. I think Keynes used to say that in the long term we shall all be dead. And that is exactly what has happened to the short-term, long-term game we've been playing now for decades. Let's get trapped in short-term arrangements, which are totally framed in the status quo, actually reinforce the institutional status quo. And then change will come in the long term. And it has never come, because then we've also jumped from one challenge to another one, but also because it was clearly a trap to send it to the nowhere, in no possible world is going to happen kind of room. So I think we need to forget the short and long term. We need to talk about false solutions, band-aid, false solution, and systemic change. But systemic change can happen within the short term. That I think is something we need to change in our mindset. The moment in which you frame the debt discussion differently and you have it in the right term, and therefore you start that conversation with, first of all, you owe me money, historically, ecologically, and more. Now let's talk about your contract. I think it's a different approach politically to confront a particular challenge. And we also need to recognize that this short-term trap has been traditionally a short circuit between northern NGOs and northern governments. That's really what has happened, largely. So I think let's free ourselves from this short, long-term thing. Let's think about systemic transformation, and let's frame it in the immediate. Let's not allow for it to be kicked to tomorrow. Secondly, on the transition transformation, I think we've invented what I can call radical reformism. And the issue is that a conundrum or something that exists in reality? Now, it is a conundrum where we change our narratives, but we keep on doing the same. So now everyone in our organizations has a narrative in which we are counter-colonial, decolonial, counter-racial, and everything else. But we keep on doing very often the same things, you know? So when that is what we mean by radical reformism, I think it's a conundrum. But there is another approach of maybe radical reformism, which is the generation of dissonance. You know, and I think the tax decision in the UN generates dissonance. It generates a problem within the system that automatically sends shockwaves, you know, across other systems. So sometimes that maybe notion of radical reformism is that you still operate within the multilateral frame, but you generate elements of dissonance, of disruption that, as a default, involve further change. And this takes me to Bridgetown. Well, there's no dissonance within Bridgetown. That's the problem within it. It is pretty much operates within the frame of existing institutions by just gaining a little bit more incremental change in the voice of developing countries or in the concerns of developing countries, but completely within the system. And there's a massive mismatch between his narrative and his proposed actions. And to be honest, I'm sorry to say that it's also an electoral platform. So we're not surprised that there is the Macron capture. I'm not too sure how much is Macron and how much is the need of a possible prospective Secretary General to be able to go along with the kind of songs that are being sung by the West as well, you know? And I think this is a little bit where the option of finance of FFD4 comes in. You're talking about a process where to some extent there are no surprises, you know? The reasons why they try to avoid it, particularly in the global north, is because they know what's coming within it. It has been built in 20 years of political build-up of power within the Group of 77 and clarity of what the challenge is. So they know perfectly well what's coming with that. It's gonna be the mother of many struggles for the Group of 77 on the first side. And this is where we need to understand where we locate ourselves, what kind of social base we build to be able to assist, to engage in that particular struggle. I think it's ahead of us, and it's probably a major moment to prepare for, because some of these elements of dissonance can be built in that particular moment. Thank you.
Excellent. The mother of all struggles. This is such a good cliffhanger for the strategy discussion that we'll be having after the break. And just before I wrap up this panel, two quick practical things. One is that believe me, you all still look great, and that's super because we're doing the group photo outside, so exercise your smiles and please join us for that. And afterwards, go have a look at the banner that talks about the knowledge management platform. And it is a resource where you can find a lot of good information and reports and knowledge from the Eurodata network. So we want to explain to you what it is, so please check it out. And lastly, but definitely not least, it is for me to say one thanks to this amazing panel, to Professor Jati Ghosh, always a fantastic pleasure, and to the dear colleagues that had the nerve and bravery to join me up here this morning, and hopefully keep you all well entertained and awake and warm you up for the exciting strategy discussions that we'll be having after the coffee. Thank you, everyone, and thank you to all of you in the audience. It's been a great discussion.